Hey, what's up guys? Irish Turtle here, and welcome to today's video on Rainbow Six Siege 1 year on. So, in today's video, I want to talk about the last year of Siege and its potential future in my eyes. So let's start with when the game released, December 1st, 2015. When it launched, it was considered to be one of the most interesting and tactical shooters to be seen in a while, which shook the genre for multiplayer games and what they could be at the time. It was also the first Rainbow Six game to shape the cover shooter mechanics that it had been so famous for in its previous iterations. Unfortunately, at the time of release, Siege was not particularly well received by the review community, with less than a handful of positive reviews coming at launch. Most of the problems appeared to be relating to the lack of single player, lack of varying game modes, lack of maps, and as such it was viewed just as a whole to have a lack of diversity. And it got many negative reviews, and even to this day, Siege still has a Metacritic score of 79, and as an average, 80 tends to be where the good ones sit, and that's where they tend to start their score at. So you've kind of got an idea, it's close, but it didn't quite hit great, on at least the Metacritic scale. But what made Siege so great then in the eyes of the players? Well, a lot of people believe it was to do with the varying gameplay tactics available to players, the extreme variation in destruction and intelligence gathering mechanics, making it a more versatile game than when compared to your average straight up shooter like COD. It also required many a team to develop real synergy between chosen operators, having them require to balance abilities with who they picked and what loadouts they had. It also promoted real-time communication between players, and if you compared this with, say, the other games that have released, you didn't require as much communication as you would with Siege. And I have to say, if my year of Siege has taught me anything, it's that real communication gets shit done. Other contributing factors to the success was down to things like the map design from Ubisoft, because essentially the intuitive destruction system in place on the few maps that they were slated for having, could actually be considered more impressive because of how the maps could be changed with the destruction system. If you ask me, I'm happier with the fewer maps because they in majority work well and have so many more tactical options when it comes to playing them. And because of this, you'll often end up playing the same map but in an entirely different way once you know what you're doing in Siege, lending it to the map feeling different each time. So essentially what that meant was you could play the same map at least 3 or 4 times, and once you have the ability to understand how to play each map, you could put down defenses, you could put down attacking gadgets, and you could change up the layout of the map quite easily and on the fly, making it feel very different each round and each game. Now, it's not to say there weren't issues at launch with Siege, because there were. Considering the misleading trailers shown at E3, making the game seem very much more cinematic than it was, what was considered a high purchase price compared to amount of content didn't exactly go down too well, and the in-game microtransactions at launch weren't viewed too fondly by the public, so Ubisoft didn't particularly lead with their best foot forward on launch. This became evident even more so 2 weeks after launch, where Ubisoft held a free weekend which fueled the fires of people saying this game had failed. There was even one article by Forbes that suggested that the game should go free to play, and quite frankly I'm glad they ignored that bullshit and kept on with their system as it was. Also, another issue was at launch, the matchmaking and netcode left a considerable amount to be desired, which sadly I have to say is still an issue currently. It was briefly fixed, but it's gone a little bit broken again. But despite these issues, the game persisted and refused to give up and die like other shooters that failed at launch before it. Ubisoft announced their plans for DLC, and they essentially said they were going to add in new maps and operators, and the DLC purchases would be completely optional, with those choosing not to purchase their season pass still having access to the maps at each season launch, and operators simply a week after season pass holders, which addressed the issue that so many other shooters out there have, which is when they run into their DLC policy, they tend to divide the player base between those with and without DLC. The best example of this is COD. They release a new DLC, and the player base divides between those who want it and those who don't. Because of this, the player base reduces, it gets smaller and smaller throughout their season releases of DLC, and because of that, it's one of the reasons COD has to pump out a new game every year, because they have to try and rejuvenate a reduced player base with a base Call of Duty game. Thankfully, Siege avoided this, and it's not required to pump out a new game every year. Siege then also moved on to fix many of the issues reviewers had pointed out at launch. On January 29th, Siege officially announced an ESL League, and around the same time they fixed many of the issues with matchmaking and netcode, which I'm quite happy to say managed to stay fixed until around about July time. They also changed up ranked matches to make it more diverse and interesting from a tournament standpoint, along with the introduction of spectator mode to allow people to actually view it instead of just having it from person's view. Now, unfortunately, with the introduction of a tournament came the inevitable flood of players abusing hacks and cheats to win at ranked, and believe me, did they flood in. You could barely go a couple of games without someone having questionable aim or luck or amazing wall bang that you couldn't quite believe. And along with this, the amount of accusations that were flung around became absolutely almost unbearable. Considering this was a game about intel and walls that could be shot through, it didn't take much more than a lucky wallbang or a smart information use to have you called a hacker or you calling somebody else a hacker. This led to a new policy from Ubisoft for cheaters that was introduced with the Dustline DLC in May. This was the 2-strike policy for those caught cheating. Essentially, you would get a 15-day ban on your first offence and your second offence would be permanent. This was then changed to a 1-strike policy in June following Blizzard's lead in Overwatch. This was the straight out, you're caught, you're gone policy, we will not have you back. This only really took effect though upon the launch of BattlEye in August, or around mid-season 3 if you like, when they actually started catching more cheaters. I think their original report was in the first ban wave alone, 3,800 accounts were terminated, and then in subsequent bans obviously that's increased, but it was a step in the right direction for Ubisoft, and it couldn't have come really sooner, but it came in eventually. And that's the main thing. Obviously, saying that, this release of BattlEye was after they'd released the Starter Edition of Siege. Now, while this did address the cost of Siege and reduce it by quite a lot, it allowed too many players who had already bought the game either to purchase Smurf accounts or purchase an account that they would abuse with hacks. So essentially, while yes, the Starter Edition helped, it also aided itself to Smurf accounts and hackers being increased in that time. Now, despite all these issues that were around the launch and around the subsequent months, in summer the game hit headlines for news places as having more daily concurrent players than it did at launch, reaching the 1 million players mark. Similarly, around this time, many of the negative reviews conducted about Siege did a complete 180 and said the game was actually really good and was in a good place. It was reported that Siege had more daily players after the Red Crow DLC than Infinite Warfare, at least with regards to PC. But the point was, the game had survived a rocky release and established itself as a competitive shooter to rival that of Call of Duty and Counter-Strike. The DLC up to this point had managed to provide a host of new operators who all felt balanced within the game, as well as still keeping the original operators relevant to the gameplay. Some of the best examples of this are things like IQ became much more relevant with the introduction of Echo and Valkyrie, as they had more gadgets to be detected and taken out. They also introduced headgears and weapon charms, which, while taking a fairly long time to grind, added something for the player base to purchase with their credits. So as a whole, it seemed Ubisoft made good on their promise to support this game post-launch, which is amazing considering their track record with games, and the fact that their recent games Steep, they've gone back to the shitty case of walling off content to non-DLC holders. It seems as though they somehow took a step back with Siege and made a completely different decision, which was very unlike Ubisoft, but paid off in the long run. Quite frankly, I'm surprised they went back to their old system with Steep and didn't keep their current one in an attempt to keep players coming back to their games. So it's an interesting thing to see. They made a change that worked, but they've ignored it. But obviously the game's going well, it's in a good state, and we've just been promised another year of DLC and support and more fixes and improvements, which is just more evidence to the fact that the game is doing well and is one of Ubisoft's forefront games at the minute. Now, while the future does look quite good, there are some problems I see for the future of Siege. Firstly is the netcode and matchmaking. At some point in August, they seem to have both broken the netcode and matchmaking and gone back to how they were pre-January, which I have to say feels like a shame as it ruins the nature of the game as a whole. Also, Uplay feels like a poor system to be running a shooter on. I don't know if it's just my friends and me, but we've had problems setting up a party, getting friends into games, maintaining the party in a game, and it just feels so counterintuitive for a team-based shooter. The Uplay system is not good, and Ubisoft's reliance on it just seems like such a crutch for them. If they were just to remove that and use simply Steam, or actually, just Steam, just use Steam. It works, and it works well. Why they have an insistence on a Uplay system that is so flawed is beyond me. Also, the gameplay pacing has led to some shifts in how people play. With regards to things like spawn killing becoming a more viable tactic, I can't tell you how good it feels to play a round of ranked where a player isn't trying to spawn rush and we actually get a solid 5v5 game without this cheesy tactic being used and then one team being a player down from the off. Especially considering Ubisoft have been trying to make these tactics a lot harder to achieve. It seems that in every game I play, it gets tried at least once per game, if not more, and it seems to become a staple of gameplay. I don't know if it's because of the way they're playing the maps, but it feels like this is something they need to fix, because the amount of players you see who get angry over being spawn killed far outweighs those who manage to pull off a spawn kill, and quite frankly, while yes I do it myself, and yes I don't mind people doing it, I do see a lot of players complain about it, and it is a risk to the player base of people getting frustrated about being killed in the first few seconds of a round. And, I understand that people have to learn about that, but it doesn't necessarily positively affect the game. Now, I do feel as though I have to address the community, especially after talking about spawn killing. Now, as a whole, at launch, the Siege community was absolutely fantastic. There was the odd toxic moron here and there, but as a whole, it was good. People were nice, helpful human beings, they'd make call-outs, give useful input, and you'd still get that from time to time now, if the stars happen to have aligned right. But seriously, the majority of players have seriously fallen in their maturity and tolerability, and the player base has taken essentially a nosedive off the cliff in recent months. Hardly anyone communicates anymore. People are always talking absolute trash and bullshit in the chat, and nobody is helpful, unless I said like on a rare occasion. The other day, I played a game, and a teammate went down, and I asked him where he was shot from. I got no reply, and then 10 seconds later, after trying to push the corner, I was killed by the same enemy. The teammate who was down wrote in chat, "You're such a shit noob," referring to me. And I said, well, had you made a call out, I might have known, and instead of going, fair enough, he steps on his mic and tries to berate me instead of saying, fair enough, I get what you mean, I was wrong. I mean, what's the point in acting like a child instead of giving out relative information? I can't help but feel the starter edition kind of paved the way for these self-entitled ignorant pricks to rear their heads in game. Essentially because, the starter edition came out and it meant younger people who weren't mature enough for the game could buy it, or people that like being dicks could buy it, and the community kind of went downhill from there. The same thing happened with CSGO. Once it became cheaper, more and more dickheads started playing. It seems to be a typical thing that happens. And unfortunately, it happened with Siege when the starter edition came out. And since then, every time there's been a starter edition, more of these players have seemed to appear. So, as a whole, I'd argue maybe the starter edition isn't a good idea, or maybe they need to have a way of getting rid of these players a bit more. Ubisoft did acknowledge these types of players and actually introduced a system to ban toxic players, but I can't say it's been doing much in the way of working, as you still see it all the time. But as a whole, going off this topic, the game is good, and I still do enjoy it as much as I did at launch, if not more. I still find myself wanting to play it and create content about it, as is evidenced by this video, even if a lot of people don't watch my content. There's a lot of fun to be had here, and if you happen to be watching this but haven't picked up the game, I urge you to do so. Now is probably one of the best times to get involved, just before the next season of DLC starts, right after the last season is finished, and I think you should get it. I do have some worries over the new operators and how they'll fit into the balance, but I can't wait to see how they'll change the game's meta, as all the previous ones have done a really good job of this. I'm looking forward to seeing the series flourish and challenge the Call of Duty franchise as a competitive shooter. It's nice to see something else out there that does well and actually requires proper teamwork. Siege is the only game to make changes now where every second counts in a ranked match, and where you can blow holes in a wall and the map and like the layout of a map, it completely changes. And because of that, it requires the teams to make changes on the fly. It's essentially the kind of game where the right placement of a gadget or even direction you're looking in can sway the tide of a round and lead to a win. It's such a great game, and I mean, I'm coming up to my 200th hour on the second platform I've owned this game on. And I've got no plans of stopping anytime soon. And I can't say any other game has gripped me enough to keep me coming back to it like Siege has. It may be flawed in areas, but it's made its claim in the competitive FPS market. I don't see it losing ground anytime soon, if not taking more ground from other shooters. But let me know your thoughts on Siege. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Are you losing interest? Or are you a die-hard fan that's going to be here until the next game starts or until the servers die? Let me know in the comments below. I'm really interested to hear what you guys have to say. As always, if you like the video, don't forget to like the video, obviously, as it really does help me out. And also, why not consider sharing it on social media and with your friends? Subscribe for more Rainbow Six Siege content, and I'll see you in the next one.